Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel, True Fear and Fiction. Step into the shadows and explore the chilling world of horror. Before watching, please like and subscribe to support me in producing more stories. This helps spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt as I shifted into gear, the hum of my rig vibrating through my bones. Nightfall had a way of enveloping the world in a thick, dark blanket, a silence punctuated only by the occasional howl of the wind and the rumble of my truck's engine. I was no stranger to these lonely highways, where the glow of the headlights flickered like distant stars against the inky blackness. As I drove, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearing midnight, the hour when the line between reality and the unreal began to blur. The air was thick with a heavy stillness, and I could almost hear the echo of long-forgotten stories whispered by the ghosts of the road. Truckers like me often shared tales about the haunted stretches of highway, stories of things that lurked just beyond the veil of night. I'd always dismissed them as mere folklore, figments of an overactive imagination, but that night felt different, charged with an energy that sent a shiver down my spine. I flipped through the radio stations, seeking some solace in the sound of music or chatter, but all I found was static, punctuated by the occasional crackle. Just as I was about to give up and succumb to the oppressive silence, a voice broke through the white noise. It was a low, almost soothing tone, speaking about the dangers of the night, warning listeners to be cautious on the desolate roads. I frowned, a chill creeping into my bones as I turned the volume up, captivated by the warning. Suddenly, I spotted something unusual in my rearview mirror, a faint light bobbing in the distance, almost like a will-o'-the-wisp. My heart raced, and I felt an inexplicable urge to follow it, as if it were beckoning me deeper into the night. I knew better than to let curiosity get the best of me, but something about that light drew me in. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of uncertainty, but as I looked again, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I pushed on, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and I was beginning to feel the weight of fatigue pressing down on me like an unwelcome passenger. Just then, I saw it, a figure standing at the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. My heart dropped into my stomach as I slammed on the brakes, gravel skidding beneath my tires, the figure coming into clearer view. A woman, disheveled and pale, with wild hair that framed her face like a halo of despair, stood there, her clothes tattered and stained. She raised her hand, palm out, as if pleading for help. Instinct kicked in. I had to stop. I rolled down my window, the night air rushing in, cold and heavy with an unsettling silence. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness like glass shattering. She leaned closer, her eyes wide and glossy, and for a moment, I thought I saw something dark swirling behind her gaze. "Please, I need a ride," she said, her voice trembling. "My car broke down. I was waiting for someone." There was an edge to her words that set my teeth on edge, but I couldn't leave her there alone. The desolation of the road echoed in my mind, and I knew how unforgiving the night could be. "Hop in," I said, forcing a smile, trying to quell the rising sense of dread. As she climbed into the cab, I noticed the chill that followed her, a breath of icy air that seeped into the warmth of the truck. I introduced myself, but she didn't respond, staring straight ahead, her fingers trembling on her lap. I flicked the headlights back on, and as I pulled back onto the road, I could feel her gaze burning into me, a weight that made it difficult to breathe. The miles stretched out in front of us, the night swallowing the landscape whole. I attempted small talk, asking where she was headed, but she merely shrugged, her silence thickening the air between us. I turned my attention back to the road, the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the endless asphalt. The radio crackled again, a voice warning about the dangers of picking up hitchhikers, telling stories of those who never made it to their destination. My heart raced, and I stole a glance at her. She was still staring, her face expressionless, eyes locked on some unseen point in the darkness. "You okay?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. "Just tired," she muttered. but her voice felt distant, as if she were speaking from far away, her mind trapped in a place I couldn't reach. The highway stretched on, and the further we drove, the more uneasy I felt. I swore I could hear whispers drifting through the cab, murmurs in a language I didn't understand. It was as if the night was alive, breathing and watching, the shadows stretching like fingers reaching out to claim us. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white, trying to focus on the road, but my mind was racing. "Why were you out there?" I asked, breaking the oppressive silence. "It's dangerous at night." She turned her head slowly, her eyes piercing into mine, and I felt a jolt of fear shoot through me. "I was waiting for someone," she repeated, her voice low and almost melodic, but there was something wrong, something off about her. The shadows seemed to grow denser around us, creeping closer as if they could sense my growing anxiety. Just then, the truck's lights flickered, casting ominous shadows that danced along the roadside. I glanced at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was dropping dangerously low, despite having filled up just hours before. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, realizing that the nearest gas station was miles away, a thought that tightened the knot in my stomach. "Don't worry," she said suddenly, her tone soothing but laced with something dark. "We won't run out." Her words sent chills down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was spiraling into a nightmare. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a tempest, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching, lurking in the darkness just beyond the reach of the headlights. I forced myself to focus on the road, but the shadows seemed to morph into twisted figures, dancing just at the edge of my vision. "Where did you say you were going?" I pressed, trying to keep the conversation alive, trying to ignore the gnawing fear creeping into my mind. "Home," she said simply, but the way she said it sent a shiver through me. "I just want to go home." The road seemed to stretch endlessly before us, and I could feel the truck's engine sputtering, the weight of fatigue crashing over me like a wave. My eyelids grew heavy, and I fought to stay awake, to keep the darkness at bay. The woman's presence was both comforting and terrifying, a paradox that filled the cab with a palpable tension. Suddenly, she leaned closer, her breath cold against my ear, whispering something incomprehensible that sent a chill racing down my spine. The lights flickered again, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something horrifying reflected in her eyes, something ancient and hungry that made my heart race. I couldn't take it anymore. "I have to pull over," I said, my voice shaking as I searched for a place to stop. The shadows closed in tighter, the whispers crescendoing into a deafening roar as I found a small turnout and slammed the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. "Why are we stopping?" she asked, her tone suddenly sharp, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "I can't keep driving like this," I replied, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I need a moment." As I sat there, panting, I felt the weight of her stare on me, an intensity that felt both invasive and suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, the screen illuminating the cab with a weak glow, revealing her face twisted in an unsettling smile. "You shouldn't have picked me up," she said softly, her voice a mere whisper that echoed in the stillness. "What do you mean?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. But before she could respond, a loud bang shattered the night, a sound that reverberated in my chest, followed by an unnatural silence. The lights flickered one last time before plunging us into darkness. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in an eerie stillness, the only sound my ragged breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. "Get out," she whispered, her voice low and insistent, a command laced with something dark and ancient. I felt paralyzed, the fear locking me in place as I struggled to comprehend the situation. "Get out," she shouted, her voice echoing with an otherworldly power that shook me to my core. I opened the door and stumbled out into the night, the air thick with an oppressive energy. I looked back at her, but the cab was empty, a shell of what had been. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted into the darkness, the whispers following me, wrapping around me like a shroud. As I ran, the shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and I could feel them closing in. The night seemed alive, the road itself shifting beneath my feet. The light from my truck flickered faintly behind me, casting ghostly silhouettes that twisted into grotesque forms, and I knew I had to escape whatever haunted presence lurked in the dark. I ran until my lungs burned, until the sound of my heart pounded like a drum in my ears. I stumbled through the thick underbrush, branches clawing at my skin as I plunged deeper into the night. Behind me, I could hear her voice echoing, soft and haunting, calling out my name, coaxing me back, but I fought against the pull, desperation driving me forward. Finally, I burst into a clearing, the moonlight breaking through the canopy overhead, illuminating the world in a silver glow. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, the weight of the darkness slowly lifting. But even in the moonlight, I could still feel the shadows lurking just out of sight. As I looked back, I saw the faint glow of my truck in the distance, a beacon of normalcy in the chaos. But then I noticed something. Where the truck had been parked, the figure of the woman stood in the shadows, watching me, her expression a twisted mask of sorrow and hunger. I scrambled to my feet, the realization crashing over me like a wave. I had crossed a line I could never return from. With every ounce of strength, I ran, the whispers growing louder, mingling with the wind, echoing my name as I fled deeper into the night, the road behind me fading into darkness, leaving nothing but a haunting memory of the girl who called to me from the shadows. The road stretched out like a serpent in the night, the asphalt glistening under the pale glow of my headlights. And as I drove my rig down that lonely highway, the vast emptiness around me felt almost suffocating, a blanket of black that wrapped itself tightly around the truck, the only sound breaking the silence being the rhythmic thump of the engine and the occasional creak of the cab, which seemed to whisper secrets of the road. It was nearing midnight, and I knew the weight of fatigue was creeping in, that insistent pull that begged me to close my eyes just for a moment. But I had learned the hard way that succumbing to that urge could lead to nightmares far worse than any I'd ever encountered on the open road. The radio, crackling with static, offered me no solace tonight, and I switched through the channels, desperate for something, anything, to fill the eerie silence. But all I found was a haunting rendition of an old ballad that seemed to echo my own sense of loneliness, the singer's voice rising and falling like the shadows that danced just beyond the reach of my headlights. The trees on either side of the highway loomed like dark sentinels, their branches swaying ominously in the wind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. Each time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something lurking in the dark, but there was only the endless stretch of highway behind me, a reminder of my solitude. As I pressed on, the landscape shifted, the trees receding to reveal an open field, barren and ghostly under the moonlight. And that's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the distance. I squinted, my heart pounding with an inexplicable dread, as I slowed the truck to get a better look. A figure stood just at the edge of the field, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and I felt an icy chill grip my spine. It was a woman, her dress billowing in the wind, hair streaming like a dark river behind her, but there was something unnatural about her stance, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I shook my head, dismissing it as exhaustion playing tricks on me, and pushed the gas pedal down, eager to put distance between myself and that unsettling sight. The truck roared to life, and as I accelerated, the figure vanished into the shadows, swallowed whole by the night. Yet, the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at me, making my skin crawl, as if the darkness itself had a presence, an awareness that stalked me as I drove deeper into the void. With every mile that passed, I found my focus slipping, fatigue wrapping around my mind like a thick fog, and I fought against it, rolling down the window to let the cool night air wash over me, the wind howling a mournful tune that matched the song still echoing in my mind. I told myself I only had a few more hours to go until the next rest stop, a beacon of light in this vast nothingness, but the horizon remained stubbornly dark, and the emptiness felt more oppressive with each passing minute. Just as I was about to give in to the wariness, the truck's headlights illuminated something up ahead, and I squinted into the distance. A rundown gas station stood at the edge of the road, the flickering neon sign sputtering like a dying star, promising refuge amidst the darkness. Relief washed over me and I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires, the sound somehow comforting in the silence. As I stepped out of the cab, the cold air hit me like a slap, and I shivered as I made my way toward the entrance, glancing around at the desolate surroundings. The gas station looked abandoned, with broken pumps and shattered windows, and an unsettling sense of dread gripped me. I hesitated, looking back at my truck, but the thought of spending another minute alone on the road pushed me inside. The interior was dimly lit, and as I stepped through the door, a bell jingled, announcing my arrival to the emptiness. The shelves were lined with dusty products that looked like they hadn't been touched in years, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. I walked cautiously to the counter, hoping for a flicker of life, but there was only an old, worn-out clerk, his eyes vacant and sunken, staring blankly at a television in the corner, the flickering images casting an eerie glow over his face. "Hey," I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence. "You got any coffee?" He blinked slowly, as if the question took an eternity to register, before nodding slightly and gesturing toward a pot that sat on a hot plate, the dark liquid inside bubbling gently. I poured myself a cup, the warmth radiating through the ceramic, but the bitterness of the coffee did little to dispel the gnawing feeling of unease that settled in my gut. "Strange night, isn't it?" I ventured, trying to spark some semblance of conversation, but he only grunted in response, his attention drifting back to the television, which flickered ominously with static. The silence stretched on, and I felt the walls closing in around me, the shadows pooling in the corners, alive and menacing. I glanced outside, half expecting to see the woman from the field lurking in the darkness, but the parking lot was empty, save for my truck. The air felt thick, oppressive, and I took a sip of the coffee, its bitter taste lingering in my mouth, the heat reminding me I was still alive, still moving, and yet the night seemed to mock me, as if daring me to stay. Just then, a loud crash echoed from outside, the sound cutting through the stillness like a knife, and I jumped, the coffee sloshing over the rim of my cup. "What was that?" I blurted, my heart racing. The clerk turned slowly, his expression devoid of concern, and for a moment, I felt like I was the only one aware of the encroaching dread. "I don't know," he said, his voice low and raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "You shouldn't be out here alone." The words sent a jolt of fear through me, and I took another glance outside, my heart pounding as I fought the urge to flee. I wanted to leave, to get back on the road, but the thought of stepping into that darkness alone was paralyzing. I felt trapped, caught between the safety of the gas station and the terrifying unknown that lay beyond. I turned back to the clerk, ready to voice my fears, but he had gone back to staring at the television, seemingly oblivious to my presence. The static buzzed louder, filling the air with an unsettling hum that made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm, and decided it was time to leave. As I stepped back outside, the chill of the night wrapped around me, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I hurried to my truck, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, but just as I reached for the door handle, I heard a soft whisper behind me, barely audible but distinct. "Help me." I froze, the blood running cold in my veins. I turned slowly, scanning the empty parking lot. And that's when I saw her, the woman from the field, standing at the edge of the lot, her pale dress shimmering under the moonlight, eyes wide and filled with an unfathomable sorrow. "Please," she whispered again, her voice ethereal and haunting, the desperation in her tone sending a shiver down my spine. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling as I struggled to keep my feet planted on the ground. "Help me," she repeated, taking a step closer, and as she did, I noticed the darkness swirling around her, thick and unnatural, as if it were alive, crawling toward me with a mind of its own. Panic surged within me, and I stumbled back, my heart racing as I scrambled to open the door of my truck. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it tight as I threw the engine into gear, but the sound of the woman's plea echoed in my mind, a siren song that beckoned me to the edge of sanity. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were closing in, a creeping darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. I tore out of the gas station parking lot, my tires screeching against the asphalt, and as I sped down the highway, the headlights illuminating the road ahead, I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The woman was gone, but the shadows remained, pooling around the edges of my vision, haunting me as I drove deeper into the night. Every mile felt like an eternity, the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides, and I could feel the exhaustion clawing at my mind, tempting me to close my eyes just for a second. But I couldn't let it take me. I wouldn't allow myself to succumb to the madness that lurked just outside my window. As I pressed on, the road twisted and turned, and the landscape began to shift once more, the trees closing in around me, their gnarled branches reaching toward the truck like skeletal fingers. The air felt thick, charged with a malevolence that sent chills down my spine, and I felt the overwhelming urge to scream, to release the tension coiling within me, but I held it in, the grip of fear tightening around my throat. Hours passed in a blur, the dark landscape morphing into a twisted dreamscape that felt both familiar and alien. And just as I thought I might finally see the glow of civilization, the headlights caught a glimpse of something lying in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as I came to a screeching halt, the sound of tires screeching echoing into the night. There, sprawled across the asphalt, was a figure, motionless and still, and I felt a jolt of terror surge through me as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. My instincts screamed at me to drive away, to leave this nightmare behind, but the flickering remnants of compassion urged me to check. With shaking hands, I reached for the door, opening it slowly, the night air cold against my skin as I stepped outside. The figure was a man, his clothes torn and stained, and as I approached, I could see the blood pooling around him, a dark stain against the gray asphalt. "Help," he groaned, his voice barely a whisper, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I looked around, the desolation around us swallowing us whole. "Stay still," I said, kneeling beside him, but even as I spoke, I could feel the darkness closing in, wrapping around us like a shroud. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call for help, but the screen flickered and died, leaving me in silence, the shadows growing heavier by the second. The man's eyes locked onto mine, pleading and desperate, and I felt the world around us dimming, the edges of my vision blurring. "You have to help me," he said, his voice trembling, and as he reached out a bloodied hand, I felt an overwhelming urge to recoil, to flee, but I was rooted in place, trapped by the horror unfolding before me. Just then, a low growl echoed from the woods beyond the road, and my heart seized in terror as I glanced toward the sound. The shadows shifted, and out of the darkness emerged figures, a pack of twisted shapes that crawled toward us, their eyes gleaming with malice. My breath caught in my throat, and panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Run!" I shouted, but the man only looked at me with despair, as if he knew that escape was impossible. The darkness enveloped us, and I turned to flee, sprinting back to my truck, my heart pounding as I could hear the sounds of the creatures behind me, their growls mixing with the whispers of the night. I lunged for the door, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut just as the first claw scraped against the metal, a chilling sound that sent terror coursing through my veins. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life as I slammed the truck into gear and tore down the road, leaving the nightmare behind. But as I drove into the night, the darkness seemed to cling to me, the shadows whispering my name, and I knew deep down that this wasn't over. The road stretched ahead, endless and foreboding, and as I pressed on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, the specters of the night waiting just out of sight, ready to reclaim what they had lost. With each passing mile, I felt the weight of the darkness grow heavier, a relentless presence that would stop at nothing to pull me back into its embrace. And as I drove into the black void, I realized that some roads were not meant to be traveled alone, and the night was far more alive than I had ever imagined. The highway was a ribbon of darkness, and as I navigated my truck through the desolate stretch, the headlights illuminated nothing but the endless void ahead. The clock on the dash flickered past midnight, and I felt the familiar grip of fatigue tightening around my mind, urging me to surrender to the lull of the engine's hum. The radio offered no comfort, only static mixed with the occasional ghost of a song, haunting me with its dissonance. I rubbed my eyes, trying to stave off the weariness, knowing that the long stretch ahead required my full attention. The trees lining the road twisted like skeletal fingers against the night sky, and as I drove deeper into the heart of the wilderness, the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights trailing behind, but there was nothing, just the thick, oppressive darkness that felt heavier with every passing mile. My thoughts drifted to stories I'd heard from other truckers about this route, tales of strange occurrences and vanished travelers, but I pushed those thoughts aside, chalking them up to road-worn imagination. As the miles wore on, I began to notice flickers of movement in the trees, shadows darting just beyond the reach of my headlights, and unease settled in my stomach like a stone. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, a product of fatigue. But the sensation of being watched persisted, a cold sweat breaking out along my back. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, a voice breaking through the static, urgent and frantic. "Help, someone, please." The voice was distorted, barely recognizable, yet it sent chills down my spine. I twisted the knob, desperate to find the source, but it slipped back into static. My heart raced. Had I just imagined it? Or was someone truly in trouble? I fought the urge to pull over. The night was an abyss, and every fiber of my being urged me to keep moving. Then, out of nowhere, a flicker of light caught my eye. A solitary cabin nestled among the trees, its windows glowing faintly like a beacon in the night. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to keep driving and the nagging curiosity that urged me to investigate. Maybe they had a phone, or perhaps there was someone who could help me understand what I'd just heard. I pulled into the gravel driveway, the crunch of stones under my tires shattering the silence, and as I stepped out, the night air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic that set my nerves on edge. The cabin looked ancient, its wood weathered and gray, and as I approached the door, a sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I knocked softly, the sound echoing in the stillness, and after a moment, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with wild hair and sunken eyes that seemed to glimmer with knowledge of things I could scarcely comprehend. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "The night is not safe." "Please, I heard someone on the radio. Is there a phone I could use?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly as I glanced back toward my truck, the darkness around it feeling almost alive. "No phones here," he replied, his gaze drifting past me into the night, as if he sensed something lurking just out of sight. "But you're not alone. They're always watching." "What do you mean?" I pressed, an unsettling feeling pooling in my stomach. "Who's watching?" Before he could answer, a low growl echoed from the woods, deep and menacing, sending a jolt of fear through me. The man's eyes widened, and he gestured for me to come inside. I hesitated, glancing back at my truck, but the primal instinct to flee was overpowered by the need for answers. I stepped inside, the door shutting behind me with a finality that felt ominous. The interior was dimly lit, filled with strange artifacts and photographs lining the walls, images of people long gone, their faces etched with sorrow. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me, a suffocating presence that wrapped around my throat. "You have to understand," the man continued, his voice low and urgent. "This road is a crossroads for those who have lost their way. The echoes of their despair linger here, and they seek others to join them." "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me. "What echoes?" He pointed toward the window, where the trees danced violently in the wind, shadows flickering just beyond the glass. "They call out to the living, trying to pull them into their darkness. You heard them, didn't you? The voices?" A chill ran through me as I recalled the frantic pleas from the radio, and I nodded slowly, realization dawning. "I thought it was just a trick." "It's never just a trick," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They are hungry. They want to be heard, to be remembered, and if you listen too closely, they will take you." Panic surged within me, and I turned to the door, the desire to escape overwhelming. "I need to go," I said, but he grasped my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. Listen, he implored, his eyes fierce. You have to stay alert. If you leave now, they will follow you. Just then, the growling intensified, the sound rising to a chorus of anguished cries that echoed through the woods. My heart raced as I felt the cabin tremble, a primal fear clawing at my insides. What do? I gasped, desperate for a way out. The man released my arm, his expression softening. Trust your instincts. Do not let their voices drown out your own. You are stronger than they think. As I turned to leave, the door suddenly swung open, and the wind howled into the cabin, carrying with it a cacophony of voices, pleas, whispers, cries of despair that filled the air, threatening to consume me. I stumbled back, heart pounding as I fought the overwhelming urge to succumb to their sorrow. Don't listen, the old man shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Remember who you are. I closed my eyes, focusing on my own heartbeat, the rhythm grounding me in reality, and just when I felt the darkness begin to pull at the edges of my mind, I opened my eyes wide, drawing strength from within. I ran for the door, the chaos swirling around me, and with a burst of adrenaline, I charged outside. The night was alive with shadows, figures shifting in the trees, but I didn't look back. I sprinted to my truck, the sounds of anguish clawing at my sanity, and as I jumped inside, I fumbled for the keys, the growls rising in intensity, threatening to drown me. I turned the ignition, praying for the engine to roar to life, and when it finally did, I slammed the truck into gear, tires screeching as I tore down the driveway. As I raced back onto the highway, the darkness clawed at my windows, whispers filling the cab, voices begging for recognition. I gripped the wheel tightly, fighting against the pull of despair that threatened to swallow me whole. The road stretched ahead, an endless abyss, and I could feel the shadows lurking just beyond my headlights, ready to reclaim what they had lost. With every mile I put between myself and the cabin, I felt the darkness begin to recede, the voices fading into the distance, but the memory of their cries lingered, a haunting echo that would forever remind me of the night I almost succumbed to the void. As dawn approached, the first light of morning broke through the trees, illuminating the road ahead, and I knew I had escaped, at least for now, but deep down, I understood the truth. The night was never truly finished with me, and I would always carry the weight of its whispers in my heart. The highway unfurled before me like an endless ribbon, swallowed by darkness and framed by the skeletal trees that swayed ominously in the wind. I was alone, a solitary trucker on Route 49, where stories of the supernatural and eerie encounters were whispered among drivers at rest stops. As the clock edged toward midnight, I felt a familiar fatigue tugging at my consciousness, but I fought it off, knowing better than to give in while traversing these haunted stretches. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thumping of tires against the asphalt created a monotonous lull, and I found myself scanning the shadows along the roadside, half expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. I reached for the radio, hoping for distraction, but only found static, punctuated by the occasional burst of garbled voices that sent chills racing down my spine. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I slowed the truck, my heart racing as I squinted into the darkness. At the edge of a nearby field, a figure stood silhouetted against the night sky. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the sight, and what appeared to be a woman, dressed in white, her hair flowing like a river, seemed to beckon me. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, but curiosity was a dangerous thing, and I found myself pulling to the side of the road. I stepped out of the cab, the cold air biting at my skin, and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond, just continued to sway gently, her face obscured by the darkness. I hesitated, unease settling in my gut, but I couldn't just leave her there. "Do you need help?" I asked again, taking a cautious step forward. She finally turned, her face illuminated by the moonlight, and I froze. Her eyes were hollow, devoid of life, and an otherworldly sadness radiated from her. The wind picked up, swirling around us as she whispered, "Help me." Before I could process the words, a distant growl echoed from the woods behind her, low and menacing. My heart raced, panic gripping me as I took a step back. I can't help you," I stammered, instinctively turning to flee back to my truck. But before I could move, she reached out a hand, her fingers elongating unnaturally, as if the darkness itself was pulling her toward me. "Stay," she implored, her voice weaving into the fabric of the night. I felt a pull, a terrifying connection that threatened to draw me into her despair. But I shook my head, adrenaline surging as I sprinted back to the truck. I fumbled with the door, slamming it shut and locking it tight as I threw the engine into gear. As I sped away, the figure stood still, a ghostly silhouette against the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her presence clung to me, a shroud of sorrow that I could not escape. The road ahead seemed darker, more foreboding, and as I drove, the shadows at the edges of my headlights twisted and danced, whispering secrets that made my skin crawl. The further I went, the more I felt the oppressive weight of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that unseen eyes were watching me from the tree line. The radio crackled back to life, and the same garbled voice emerged, repeating, "Help me, help me." "Stop it!" I shouted, slamming my hand against the dashboard, but the voice persisted, filling the cab with an unsettling chorus that resonated in my bones. I had to get away from here, but as I pressed the accelerator, the shadows seemed to close in, threatening to engulf me. Just then, my headlights caught sight of another figure, this one more defined, a man standing in the middle of the road, arms raised as if trying to flag me down. My heart raced at the sight, but instinct screamed at me to keep driving. I swerved to avoid him, tires screeching against the asphalt, but as I glanced back in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of his face. It was contorted in anguish, eyes wide with desperation. "What the hell?" I muttered, adrenaline pumping through me. I forced myself to keep my focus on the road, but the voices grew louder, swirling around me, drowning out the sound of the engine. "Help me," they cried, a haunting melody that tugged at my heart. A flash of light flickered in my periphery, and I turned to see the cabin looming ahead, its windows dark and silent. The stories echoed in my mind, about the cabin that stood alone on Route 49, where people who vanished were said to linger, trapped between worlds. But I had to stop. I needed to escape the chaos in my mind, even if it meant confronting the horror I'd heard about. I parked the truck, my heart pounding as I stepped out into the stillness. The night felt charged, heavy with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I approached the cabin cautiously, the air thick with tension, and as I reached the door, I hesitated. What if the stories were true? What if something terrible awaited me inside? With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped into the dimly lit interior. The air was stale, filled with the scent of decay, and as I moved further inside, I could feel the weight of eyes upon me, invisible yet palpable. The walls were adorned with photographs, faded and yellowed, depicting people who looked eerily familiar, faces twisted in despair, their eyes pleading for release. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a resounding bang. Panic surged within me as I grasped the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. The whispers returned, swirling around me, a cacophony of voices rising and falling, chanting, "Join us! Join us!" "Get away from me!" I screamed, the walls closing in as the shadows pressed closer, their tendrils reaching for me. I stumbled backward, colliding with a shelf that toppled over, sending objects crashing to the floor. A picture frame shattered, and within it lay a note, yellowed with age. I picked it up, breath hitching as I read the words scrawled in a frantic hand. "They never let go. Don't listen." That simple phrase sent a wave of clarity through me. I had to fight back. I pressed my palms against the door, focusing all my energy, pushing against the darkness that sought to consume me. "I won't listen. I won't join you," I shouted, and as I did, the shadows recoiled, the whispers faltering. With a final surge of determination, I yanked the door open, bursting into the night air. I stumbled back toward my truck, heart racing, breathless with fear. The darkness seemed to waver as I climbed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled for the keys, fingers shaking, and started the engine. As I sped away, the cabin receded into the shadows, but the voices still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the night I had faced the darkness. The road stretched before me, but I felt a weight lift, a glimmer of hope shining through the chaos. I pressed on, determined to leave Route 49 behind, but as dawn broke, casting a golden light across the horizon, I knew that the night would always linger, a shadow in the corners of my mind, whispering its secrets, a reminder of the echoes that awaited anyone brave or foolish enough to listen.